only no money, but really every year a decrease in money because of the cost of living raises. So it's been very difficult for the deafblind professional community to maintain their research agendas, looking into new interventions, etc. And at this point, virtually there's only a very, very little bit of money set aside for research and research in strategies.
Deafblind children are no longer congregated,
and we have less number of professionals to address their needs.
Rather than worrying about whether we should be using tactile sign language or visual sign language, whether finger spelling is the way forwards, whether the child needs a calendar system of symbolic objects, people love to focus on that and they think that's going to give them the way forward. But really that comes a long way after you've addressed the emotional needs of the child. And we're talking about a population of kids who can get very stressed very easily. In fact, much of their life and much of their day is high stress.
These facts are not presented to diminish the efforts of the national community of parents, teachers, and deafblind specialists that work daily.
This community is a close-knit group that is tied together through a federal-funded program by the U.S. Department of Education.
Each state has a deafblind project,
and each project is linked together by the efforts of the National Consortium on Deafblindness.
However, the educational research of deafblindness remains shallow in comparison to other disabilities,
and seems to be related to the lack of funding and difficulty in gaining access to the population since they are so spread out.
Deafblind children can't learn unless something has meaning to them. And I feel like education starts in the home, and that's why I want interveners in my home. And I want interveners who've been trained and gone to school and are degreed. I mean, I wouldn't go to a hospital and let somebody who hadn't gone to medical school treat me. Why should I let my child learn from somebody who hasn't been to school?
Deafblindness implies that there is a lack of flow of visual and auditory information that is flowing into that child at any given time. And so the intervener's role is related to that. First and foremost, they're there to help with the accessing of information. So deafblindness itself blocks access to information, to the visual and auditory flow of information, and the intervener's role is there to provide that access, to facilitate it, to get information to the child in a way that the child can understand. And then the second part of that role is to facilitate communication. So the intervener's there to work with the child to facilitate both, to get communication in receptively, to help the child learn how to get communication out expressively, and to facilitate all interaction. And then the third area that the intervener works in has to do with social and emotional well-being. We know from research that deafblindness itself is very isolating, that there's issues that occur neurologically when that information doesn't come in, that there's fear, that there's insecurity, that there's, it's a very isolating disability. And so for any child or individual to grow and be healthy, they need to that isolation needs to be overcome. So that intervener's there to have a bond and a trust with the child, to help the child feel safe, so that he or she can learn, and to work on that self-determination piece that helps the individual to make choices and grow.
You get very attached and very connected to the children or the students. I mean, they just get into your heart, and you just become, I mean, you try not to, because they're not yours, they're not your child, but you just get so into trying to figure out what they're feeling, and you want to figure out what they want and what they, and you grow very close to the families, and you work, closely with the parents, because the parents know their children better than anybody.
6 years old, I think, when we got an intervener for her. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, in an ideal world, in a utopian world, she would have been born and there would have been an intervener, and there would be a whole team in place that would have just whisked us and told us exactly what deafblindness was, and would have then started communicating and building the blocks right up front. And we would have had sign language and communication with Tanya when she was 2.
If you wanted to be an intervener in Texas, to my knowledge, you could actually start right away. You call the Texas School for the Blind, and they would set you up with the appropriate agency. And there are kids and young adults all over that are looking for interveners. The average wait right now is about 3 to 4 years.
And had been to an intervener workshop and knew Christian needed an intervener. And so we worked toward getting him that, and we lucked out. And so the last 3 years of his high school, he had an intervener, and he went from not understanding any formal sign language to understanding and using some expressive sign language. It was like night and day.
Interveners didn't exist 7 or 8 years ago. That model came out of Canada, actually. And it was like, whoa, this is great. Let's try this here. And now we have a fantastic program. It's still in its infancy, but it's really starting to grow in this state.
I was there in December training interveners in British Columbia. They are so much better trained. I was meeting interveners, chatting to them and assuming they were teachers, like really highly credentialed, experienced teachers. And then they'd say, no, I'm just the one-on-one intervener for a 12-year-old or something. And I think, oh, you're more skilled than most of the teachers I'm working with in California, because they don't have a deaf-blind training. These are like severe handicap teachers or general special ed teachers. It's really impressive what they're doing up there.
They don't have to have a degree in the state of Texas. It helps, but there is not really a degree program. There is training provided by the Texas School for the Blind where you actually can get hands-on working and be paired with a mentor who can answer questions that other people can't.
It's come a long way, but it has a lot further to go. It hasn't been that long since sign language interpreters had to be certified in the school district. It hasn't been very long, and I would like to see it where interveners have some kind of certification and the school district recognize the job, the name, the job description, what you need and what these students need to be successful and to learn.
If interveners are not used appropriately, they can produce harmful effects on kids with deafblindness.
There's just so many misunderstood areas in deafblindness, and then all the children vary so much, and there aren't any norms, so I think it is hard to develop programs that will fit all the children. But I think that we can develop programs that help each child individually. And I think it sucks to be like, oh, Helen Keller was special when her own teacher said that she was just average intelligence, and she had this whole opportunity to learn 24 hours a day. I think we should do the best we can to get that for different children.
Like most conditions, deafblindness has been with us throughout history.
And like most conditions, it took one particularly noteworthy case to bring it to public attention.
Helen Keller is a good model for a lot of people. She's an inspiration. She is an individual. She was an individual that had a certain kind of specialized support in her own time. And we recognize that. If you remember back with Helen Keller, the teacher was with her all day. I mean, communication, mobility, all of that happens within context of the whole day. So we need to have that covered.
I started to read about Helen Keller, and I was absolutely fascinated, and I fell in love with Helen Keller. My mother and father bought me a book about her. I read all about her. In the back of the book was the American Sign Language as well as Braille, and I was just fascinated by all of it. And one day, on June 1st, 1968, my parents came to me and broke the news to me that Helen Keller had passed away. And I will never forget it. I remember being in our kitchen in our home on Long Island, New York, and being in my mother's lap and crying my eyes out. And I was just inconsolable at the death of Helen Keller.
And I can't tell you how many times a year I'm called by elementary schools to come in and speak about Helen Keller, to speak about her experiences, to bring in Braille to show students of how she communicated and how she read. And I take pause in that sometimes and say, gee, there are so many deafblind people, successful deafblind people in the world today. They really should be coming in here and not speaking of Helen Keller, but showing living examples of how People of difference, deafblind people, can live a typical life with the use of assistive technology, with the use of some support system.
We have people that have gone beyond Helen Keller these days. And with the technology we have today, it's certainly possible.